It was a bright, sunny afternoon in September. The date was September 15th, and the place was Oakwood Heights. Oakwood Heights was a small, quiet neighborhood. It had green lawns, little houses, and friendly people. Well, mostly friendly people. Everyone in Oakwood Heights knew each other, at least, that's what they thought. But sometimes, even in a quiet place like this, secrets were hiding. Big secrets. And this story? It's all about one of those secrets. Let me tell you about Jake Riley. Jake was a regular guy. He wasn't super tall or super short. He wasn't super loud or super quiet. He was just Jake. He had messy brown hair and a big smile. He lived in a small house with a big front yard. That yard was his favorite thing. Why? Because Jake loved Halloween. He didn't just like it a little bit, he loved it a lot. To Jake, Halloween wasn't just a day. It was a whole big adventure. Every year, when October came, Jake turned his yard into something amazing. He called it his spooky masterpiece. What does that mean? Well, imagine this: skeletons standing by the mailbox, tombstones popping up from the grass, and spider webs hanging from the trees. He even had a fake coffin, a big wooden box that looked like it belonged in a graveyard. That coffin was special. If you got too close, it creaked open all by itself. Creepy, right? Kids in the neighborhood loved it. They'd run by, giggling and screaming, just to see it move. But this year was different. This year, Jake didn't wait for October. Nope. He started way earlier, on September 15th. That's right, more than a whole month before Halloween. Why would he do that? Was he just extra excited? Maybe. But here's the thing, Jake had a plan. A big, sneaky plan. He didn't tell anyone about it. Not his friends, not his family, not even his dog, Rusty. It was a secret, and Jake was good at keeping secrets. He hummed a little song as he worked, setting up skeletons and stringing up webs. He was happy. He had no idea how wild things were about to get. Now, not everyone in Oakwood Heights liked Jake's spooky yard. Some people smiled and waved when they walked by. Cool decorations, they'd say. Others just shrugged and kept going. But one person? Oh, she hated it. Her name was Karen Miller, and she lived right across the street from Jake. Karen wasn't like Jake. She didn't like fun or messes or anything loud. She liked rules. She liked quiet. And she really, really liked being in charge. Karen was the president of the HOA. What's an HOA? It's a group that makes rules for the neighborhood. Things like keep your grass short or no loud music after dark. Karen loved the HOA. She carried a clipboard everywhere she went. That clipboard was her best friend. She'd write down every little thing she didn't like. A kid's bike left in a driveway? Scribble, scribble. A mailbox painted the wrong color? Scribble, scribble. And Jake's Halloween decorations. Oh, you better believe she wrote about those. Karen had short, gray hair and a face that always looked mad. Her eyes were sharp, like a hawk watching for trouble. And when she saw Jake's yard, those eyes got sharper. Too loud, she'd mutter to herself. Too messy. Too everything. She didn't care that it was just fake skeletons and plastic spiders. To her, it was a big problem. A huge problem. She'd stand on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at Jake's house like it was the worst thing she'd ever seen. Most people in Oakwood Heights didn't pay much attention to Karen. They'd see her stomping around with her clipboard and just roll their eyes. There she goes again, they'd say. Some even called her HOA Karen behind her back. It was a nickname, and it fit her perfectly. She was always complaining about something. Too many flowers in Mrs. Thompson's garden. Too much noise from Mr. Lee's barbecue. Too many toys in the park. But Jake's decorations. Those were her biggest enemy yet. Jake didn't mind Karen at first. He'd wave at her from his yard, all friendly and nice. Hey, Karen. Like my new skeleton, he'd call out. She never waved back. She'd just huff and turn away, her clipboard shaking in her hand. Jake thought it was funny. He didn't know she was about to make his life a whole lot crazier. And Karen? She had no clue that Jake was about to become her biggest headache. Yep, things were about to get wild in Oakwood Heights, and neither of them saw it coming. Picture this, it's a warm September day. The sun is shining, birds are chirping, and Jake is out in his yard. He's got a ladder and a big bag of fake spider webs. He's climbing up, stretching those webs across his porch. Down the street, kids are riding bikes. A dog barks somewhere. It's a perfect day. Jake's whistling a tune, happy as can be. He steps back to look at his work. Not bad, he says to himself. Not bad at all. Then he hears it. A loud humph, from across the street. He looks up, and there's Karen. She's standing on her lawn, staring at him. Her clipboard is out, and her pen is moving fast. Scribble, scribble, scribble. Jake grins. Morning, Karen, he shouts. She doesn't answer. She just glares. That glare could scare off a ghost, I'm telling you. It's like her eyes are saying, I hate everything about you, Jake Riley. But Jake? He just keeps smiling. He's not scared of her. Not yet. See, Jake was used to Karen being grumpy. She'd been grumpy ever since he moved in 2 years ago. The first time they met, she told him his trash cans were too close to the curb. Jake didn't even know what that meant, but he nodded and moved them anyway. Another time, she said his dog barked too much. Rusty only barked at squirrels, but Jake said, okay, I'll talk to him. He was nice like that. He didn't want trouble. He just wanted to live his life and have some fun. But this Halloween stuff? This was different. Karen didn't just grumble this time. She didn't just write on her clipboard and walk away. No, she was mad. Really mad. And when Karen got mad, she didn't stop. She kept watching Jake. Every day, she'd peek out her window or stand on her porch. She'd see him add more decorations, a new tombstone here, a skeleton there, and her face would get redder and redder. Jake didn't notice at first. He was too busy with his plan. That big, sneaky plan I told you about. What was the plan? Well, I can't tell you everything yet. That'd ruin the fun. But here's a little hint, Jake wasn't just decorating for Halloween. Nope. He was setting up something bigger. Something that would surprise everyone, especially Karen. He'd giggle to himself as he worked, thinking about it. Oh, this is gonna be good, he'd say. He didn't know how right he was. Let's go back to that sunny afternoon. Jake's yard is starting to look spooky already. There's a skeleton sitting on his porch swing. It's got a goofy grin, like it's saying, hey, I'm just chilling. There's a tombstone by the walkway that says "Rip Rest in Peace." And that coffin? It's right in the middle of the yard, creaking every time the wind blows. Jake loves it. He's proud of it. He thinks it's the best thing he's ever made. Across the street, Karen's not happy. She's pacing back and forth on her porch. Her clipboard is full of notes now. Skeleton ugly, she writes. Tombstone stupid, she adds. Coffin too loud, she scribbles. She's muttering to herself, her voice sharp and grumpy. This isn't right, she says. This isn't how a neighborhood should look. Not in September. Halloween is in October. Everyone knows that. Karen wasn't wrong about one thing: it was early for Halloween. Most people waited until October to put up decorations. But Jake? He didn't care about most people. He loved Halloween so much, he wanted it to last longer. Why wait? He thought. Let's make it a 2-month party. That's why he started in September. That, and his big plan. He couldn't wait to see it all come together. But Karen didn't see it that way. To her, Jake was breaking the rules. Not HOA rules. There wasn't a rule that said no Halloween in September. But Karen's rules. Her own little list of how things should be. She liked everything neat and boring. Green grass, clean sidewalks, quiet houses. Jake's yard? It was the opposite of that. It was wild and fun and loud. And Karen couldn't stand it. So, she decided to do something. She wasn't just going to complain this time. She wasn't just going to write on her clipboard and glare. No, she was going to fight. She looked at Jake's yard one more time, her eyes narrow and mean. This stops now, she said to herself. She turned and marched inside her house. The door slammed behind her. Jake didn't hear it. He was too busy hanging a fake bat from a tree. What was Karen up to? Oh, you'll find out soon. She had a plan of her own, and it was about to make things crazy. But Jake? He had his plan too. And his was way bigger. Way sneakier. Way better. The neighborhood was about to see a battle: Jake versus Karen. Fun versus rules. Spooky versus boring. And trust me, it was going to be wild. Before I go on, let me ask you something. Have you ever had a neighbor like Karen? Someone who just can't mind their own business? Maybe they complain about your bike or your dog or your toys. Drop it in the comments, I wanna know. I bet some of you have stories just as crazy as this one. Oh, and if you like this so far, hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more to tell, and you don't wanna miss it. Back to Jake. He's still in his yard, working away. The sun's getting lower now, turning the sky orange and pink. It's a pretty day, but Jake's not looking at the sky. He's looking at his decorations. He steps back, hands on his hips, and nods. Looking good, he says. He's got no idea what's coming. No idea that Karen's about to start trouble. Big trouble. Across the street, Karen's at her kitchen table. She's got her phone in one hand and her clipboard in the other. She's madder than ever. She looks out her window at Jake's yard. That skeleton on the porch swing waves in the breeze. The coffin creaks. The tombstone glints in the sunlight. Enough is enough, she says. She starts dialing a number on her phone. Who's she calling? Oh, you'll see. It's gonna be a surprise. Jake doesn't know it yet, but his quiet little day is about to get loud. Really loud. Karen's glare might scare off a ghost, but Jake? He's not scared. He's ready. Ready for his plan. Ready for whatever Karen throws at him. He doesn't know it, but he's about to become a hero in Oakwood Heights. And Karen? She's about to wish she'd left him alone. The sun sets slowly. The neighborhood gets quiet. But not for long. Something big is coming. Something spooky. Something fun. And it all starts with Jake, his decorations, and one very grumpy neighbor. Stick around, this is just the beginning. It all started with a note. A little piece of paper that changed everything. Jake Riley woke up one morning, just like any other morning. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the air smelled like fresh grass. He stretched, yawned, and walked outside to check his mailbox. That's when he saw a white note taped right on the front. He pulled it off and read it. The words were written in big, angry letters: "Take down those hideous decorations, or I'm reporting you to the HOA." At the bottom, it said, "From Karen Miller." Jake knew who Karen was. Everyone in Oakwood Heights did. She was the grumpy lady across the street, the one who ran the HOA, the group that made rules for the neighborhood. She didn't like Jake's Halloween decorations. Not one bit. He looked at the note again and laughed. Hideous, he said to himself. These are awesome. He crumpled the paper into a little ball and tossed it in the trash can by his porch. Then he grabbed his ladder and got back to work. Karen's note? It didn't scare him. Not even a little. By lunchtime, Jake had a new decoration up: a giant spider web. It stretched all the way across his porch, from one side to the other. It was made of white string, and it looked so real, you'd think a huge spider might pop out any second. Jake stepped back and smiled. Perfect, he said. He wiped his hands on his jeans and went inside to grab a sandwich. He was happy. His yard was looking spookier every day, and that's just how he liked it. But Karen? Oh, she wasn't happy. Not at all. She was watching from her house across the street. She stood by her window, peeking through the curtains. Her face was redder than a big, round pumpkin. She didn't like the spider web. She didn't like the skeletons or the tombstones or the creaky coffin either. To her, it was all a big mess. A loud, ugly, terrible mess. And that note she left? She thought it would stop Jake. She thought he'd read it, get scared, and take everything down. But he didn't. He laughed. He kept going. And that made Karen mad. Really, really mad. So, Karen decided to do something. She wasn't going to wait anymore. She put on her shoes, grabbed her clipboard, and stormed out her front door. Her feet hit the ground hard: thump, 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 as she marched across the street. Jake was outside again, hanging a fake bat from a tree. He didn't see her coming at first. He was too busy whistling a happy tune. But then he heard her voice. Loud. Sharp. Angry. "This is a disgrace," Karen shouted. She stopped right in front of Jake's yard, pointing at a plastic skull sitting on the grass. The skull had a goofy smile, like it was laughing at her. "Look at this. It's awful. It's ugly. It doesn't belong here." Her voice was so loud, a bird flew out of a nearby tree. Jake turned around, surprised. He saw Karen standing there, her face all red, her finger shaking as she pointed. He blinked, then smiled. "Hey, Karen," he said. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" she yelled. "Everything. This yard is a disaster. Skeletons. Webs. Skulls. It's September, Jake. Halloween is in October. You can't do this." She waved her clipboard in the air like it was a weapon. Jake looked at her, still smiling. He wasn't mad. He wasn't scared. He thought she was being silly. "It's my yard, Karen," he said calmly. "I can put up whatever I want." Karen's eyes got big. She couldn't believe it. Jake wasn't listening to her. He wasn't doing what she said. She took a deep breath, her chest puffing out like a balloon. "I'm warning you, Jake Riley," she said, her voice low and mean. "Take this junk down by tomorrow, or I'm calling the police." Then she turned around and stomped back to her house. Her shoes went thump, thump, thump again, loud enough for the whole street to hear. The door slammed behind her. Bam. Jake watched her go. He scratched his head, then chuckled. "The police," he said to himself. "For decorations." He shook his head and laughed again. He wasn't worried. Not one bit. He picked up his fake bat and kept working. "Go ahead, Karen," he called out, even though she couldn't hear him. "It's my yard." Then he climbed his ladder and hung the bat right where he wanted it. To him, this was all a big joke. But to Karen? It was war. The rest of the day went by quietly. Jake finished his work and went inside. The sun went down, and the neighborhood got dark. Stars popped out in the sky, twinkling like little lights. Jake's yard looked spooky in the moonlight. The spider web glowed a little. The skeleton on the porch swing rocked back and forth in the breeze. The coffin creaked creak, creak, creak. It was perfect. Jake loved it. He went to bed with a big smile on his face. But across the street, Karen wasn't smiling. She was sitting at her kitchen table, her phone in her hand. She was still mad. Madder than ever. She looked out her window at Jake's yard. That skull was still there, grinning at her. The spider web waved in the wind. The coffin creaked louder than before. "He didn't listen," she muttered. "I told him to take it down, and he didn't listen." She tapped her fingers on the table. Tap, tap, tap. She was thinking. Planning. And then she made up her mind. The next morning came fast. Jake woke up early, like always. He went outside to check his decorations. Everything was still there: the web, the skull, the coffin. "Good," he said. He grabbed a broom to sweep his porch. It was another sunny day, warm and bright. He was happy. He didn't think about Karen's warning. To him, it was just talk. Silly, grumpy talk. But Karen? She wasn't talking anymore. She was doing. She stood on her lawn, her phone pressed to her ear. She'd waited until Jake was outside. She wanted him to see this. She wanted him to know she wasn't kidding. She'd called the police. Yep, the real police. She told them there was a problem in the neighborhood. A big problem. She said Jake's yard was breaking rules. She said it was dangerous. She said they had to come right now. A few minutes later, it happened. Sirens started wailing. They were far away at first, but they got louder. Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. Jake stopped sweeping. He looked up, confused. "What's that?" he said. He turned his head and saw a police car coming down the street. Its lights flashed red and blue. It stopped right in front of his house. Two cops stepped out. They were tall, wearing dark uniforms and shiny badges. One had a notepad. The other had a serious face. Karen watched from her lawn. She crossed her arms and smirked. A smirk is a sneaky little smile, like when you think you've won something. And that's exactly what Karen thought. She thought she'd won. She thought the police would tell Jake to take everything down. She thought they'd make him stop. She stood there, proud and happy, waiting for it to happen. The cops walked toward Jake's yard. Jake put down his broom and waved. "Hey, officers," he said. "What's up?" He wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. He was just curious. The cop with the notepad looked at the decorations. He saw the spider web, the skull, the coffin. He raised an eyebrow. "We got a call," he said. "Someone said this stuff is a problem." Jake grinned. "A problem? It's just Halloween decorations." He pointed at the skull. "That's Fred. He's harmless." The cop with the serious face chuckled. "Fred, huh," he said. He looked at the coffin. It creaked right on cue. Creak, creak. "Pretty cool," he added. The other cop nodded. "Yeah, not bad." Karen heard that. Her smirk disappeared. "What?" she shouted. She marched over, her clipboard flapping in her hand. "This isn't cool. It's a disgrace. It's against the rules." She pointed at Jake. "Arrest him. Make him take it down." The cops turned to her. The one with the notepad sighed. "Ma'am," he said, "these are just decorations. They're not illegal." Karen's mouth dropped open. "Not illegal," she said. But they're ugly. They're loud. They're wrong." She waved her clipboard again. "I'm the HOA president. I say they have to go." The cop with the serious face shrugged. "HOA rules aren't the same as laws," he said. "He can keep them up if he wants." Jake smiled bigger than ever. He leaned against his porch railing, watching Karen turn redder and redder. She looked like she might explode. "This isn't over," she yelled. She stormed back to her house, her shoes thumping again. Thump, thump, thump. The cops shook their heads and got back in their car. "Have a good day," one said to Jake. Then they drove off. The sirens faded away. Wee-oh, gone. Jake laughed. "Well, that was fun," he said. He picked up his broom and started sweeping again. He wasn't mad. He wasn't upset. He thought it was hilarious. Karen called the police, and they didn't even care. To him, it was a big win. But here's the thing, Karen wasn't done. Not even close. She was already planning her next move. And Jake? He didn't know it yet, but he had a secret. A big, sneaky secret. Something that was going to flip everything upside down. See, Jake wasn't just a guy who liked Halloween. He was smart. Really smart. And he'd been watching Karen for a while. He knew she was up to something. Something sneaky. Something bad. That's why he had his plan, the big one I told you about before. He didn't tell anyone about it. Not the cops, not his neighbors, not even his dog, Rusty. But it was there, hiding, waiting for the right moment. Karen didn't know about Jake's secret. She thought she was in charge. She thought she could scare him, boss him around, make him stop. When she got back to her house, she slammed the door. Bam. She grabbed her phone again. If the police won't help, she said to herself, I'll call them again. I'll keep calling. I'll win. Her voice was loud and shaky. She was so mad, she didn't even hear the coffin creaking across the street. But Jake heard it. He looked at the coffin and smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a little remote. He pressed a button, and the coffin creaked louder. Creak, creak. He giggled. Oh, Karen, he said quietly. You have no idea. He put the remote back in his pocket and kept sweeping. He wasn't scared of her. He wasn't worried about the police. He had something up his sleeve, and it was big. The day went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Kids rode their bikes down the street, laughing and shouting. A dog barked somewhere. It was a normal day in Oakwood Heights, or so it seemed. But under the surface, things were heating up. Karen was mad. Jake was ready. And that secret? It was like a bomb, ticking quietly, waiting to go off. Karen sat in her house, plotting. She wrote more notes on her clipboard. Call police again, she scribbled. Tell HOA board, she added. Make Jake pay. She tapped her pen on the table, tap, tap, tap. She wasn't giving up. She was going to fight. She looked out her window and saw Jake sweeping. He waved at her, all friendly and nice. That made her even madder. He's laughing at me, she muttered. He thinks he's won. But he hasn't. Jake didn't hear her. He didn't know what she was saying. He just kept working, happy and calm. The spider web sparkled in the sunlight. The skull grinned. The coffin creaked. He loved it all. But deep down, he knew Karen wasn't done. He knew she'd try something else. And he was ready for it. More than ready. The tension was building. You could feel it in the air, like a storm coming. Karen versus Jake. Rules versus fun. Quiet versus spooky. It was a battle, and it was just getting started. Karen thought she had the power. She thought she could win. But Jake? He had that secret. That big, sneaky secret. And when it came out, oh boy, it was going to change everything. What was the secret? I can't tell you yet. That's for later. But here's a hint, it had something to do with that coffin. And it was going to turn Karen's world upside down. She didn't see it coming. She didn't have a clue. She stood there, smirking and plotting, thinking she was the boss. But Jake? He was the one with the real power. And he was just waiting for the right time to use it. The day stretched on. The sun got hot. Jake finished sweeping and sat on his porch. He looked at his yard and nodded. Looking good, he said. Across the street, Karen looked out her window and frowned. Looking bad, she said. They were so close, just a street apart, but they were miles away in their heads. Jake was having fun. Karen was fuming. And the neighborhood? It was about to see something wild. So, there it was, the start of the big fight. A note, a shout, some cops, and a whole lot of tension. Karen thought she could stop Jake. Jake thought she could try. But neither of them knew how crazy things were about to get. That secret was hiding, waiting, ready to pop out and surprise everyone, especially Karen. And when it did. Oh, you're gonna love it. Stick around, because this is just the beginning. The police car was gone now. The sirens had faded away, and the street was quiet again. Jake stood on his porch, broom in hand, watching the empty road. He chuckled to himself. Karen really called the cops, he said. Over a plastic skull. He shook his head and leaned the broom against the railing. The sun was high in the sky, shining bright. His yard looked awesome. The giant spider web sparkled. The skeleton on the porch swing waved in the breeze. The coffin creaked like it was saying hello. Jake loved it all. Across the street, Karen was not loving anything. She was back in her house, pacing back and forth in her kitchen. Her shoes went tap, tap, tap on the floor. Her face was still red, and her clipboard was on the table, covered in angry scribbles. He didn't listen, she muttered. I told him to stop, and he didn't listen. She stopped pacing and looked out her window. There was Jake, sitting on his porch, smiling like nothing happened. That made her even madder. Karen grabbed her phone again. She wasn't done. Not even close. If the police won't help, she said to herself, I'll call them again. And again. Until they do something. She started dialing. Her fingers shook a little because she was so upset. She pressed the numbers 9-1-1 and put the phone to her ear. Hello, she said when someone answered. Yes, I need the police. There's a big problem in my neighborhood. Jake didn't know she was calling again. He was too busy looking at his yard. He stood up and walked down the steps to check his decorations. The plastic skull Fred was still grinning. Jake patted it on the head. Good job, Fred, he said. Then he walked over to the coffin. It creaked louder when he got close. Creak, creak. He smiled and reached into his pocket. He pulled out that little remote again. He pressed the button, and the coffin creaked even more. Perfect, he said. He put the remote back and nodded. Just perfect. But then he heard something. A sound in the distance. Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. Sirens again. Jake turned around, surprised. No way, he said. He looked down the street and saw it another police car. The lights flashed red and blue, just like before. It rolled up and stopped in front of his house. 2 more cops got out. One was a lady with a ponytail. The other was a man with a mustache. They looked at Jake's yard and then at each other. Karen burst out of her house. She ran across the street, her clipboard flapping in her hand. There, she shouted, pointing at Jake. He's the problem. Look at this mess. Arrest him. Her voice was loud and squeaky. The lady cop raised an eyebrow. Ma'am, she said, we got a call about an emergency. Is this it? She pointed at the spider web. Karen nodded fast. Yes. Yes. It's awful. It's breaking all the rules. Jake crossed his arms and leaned against the coffin. He was still smiling. Hey, officers, he said. She called you again, huh? The man with the mustache nodded. Yep. Second call today. He looked at the decorations. This is what she's mad about. Jake laughed. Yeah. She doesn't like Fred. He pointed at the skull. The lady cop smiled a little. Fred's pretty funny, she said. Karen stomped her foot. Funny? Funny. This isn't funny. This is a disgrace. He's ruining the neighborhood. She waved her clipboard so hard, it almost flew out of her hand. The mustache cop sighed. Ma'am, we told you before. These aren't illegal. He can keep them up. Karen's mouth opened wide. But I'm the HOA president, she yelled. I say they have to go. The lady cop shook her head. HOA doesn't make the law, she said. He's not hurting anyone. She looked at Jake. You good? Jake nodded. Yep. Just having fun. The cops shrugged and turned to leave. Stop calling us about this, the mustache cop said to Karen. It's not an emergency. They got back in their car and drove off. Wee-oh-oh, gone again. Karen stood there, frozen. Her face was redder than ever, like a tomato about to burst. She glared at Jake. He waved at her, all friendly and nice. See ya, Karen, he called out. She didn't wave back. She turned around and marched back to her house. The door slammed bam, so loud it made the windows shake. Jake laughed again. She's not happy, he said to himself. He picked up a rake and started cleaning up some leaves. To him, this was all a big game. But inside her house, Karen wasn't playing games. She was fuming. She threw her clipboard on the table thud, and sat down hard. He's laughing at me, she said. He thinks he's so smart. But I'll show him. She grabbed a pen and started writing. Call HOA board, she wrote. Tell everyone about Jake. Make new rules. She tapped the pen on the table, tap, tap, tap. She wasn't giving up. She was going to fight harder. Jake didn't know what she was writing. He was outside, raking leaves and humming a song. The sun was warm, the sky was blue, and his yard looked spooky and fun. He stepped back to look at it all. The spider web was huge. The skeleton rocked on the swing. The coffin creaked in the breeze. Awesome, he said. He reached into his pocket again and pulled out the remote. He pressed it, creak, creak. The coffin got louder. He giggled. Oh, this is gonna be good, he said. What was gonna be good? Well, Jake had that secret. That big, sneaky secret I keep hinting about. He wasn't just putting up decorations for fun. Nope. He was up to something. Something big. Something that had to do with that coffin and that remote. He didn't tell anyone, not the cops, not his neighbors, not even his dog, Rusty. But it was there, hiding, waiting for the right moment to come out. Karen didn't know about the secret. She thought Jake was just a silly guy who liked Halloween too much. She thought she could scare him with her notes and her calls to the police. But every time she tried, it didn't work. The cops didn't care. Jake didn't stop. And that made her madder and madder. She looked out her window again. Jake was raking leaves, smiling like always. He's mocking me, she muttered. He thinks he's won. But he hasn't. The day went on. Kids rode by on bikes, shouting and laughing. A squirrel ran up a tree. The neighborhood was alive and happy except for Karen. She sat at her table, writing and plotting. "I'll call the police again tomorrow," she said. "And I'll call the HOA board. I'll tell them Jake's breaking rules. I'll make him stop." She nodded to herself, sure she had a good plan. But Jake? He had a better plan. He finished raking and sat on his porch steps. He looked at the coffin and smiled. He pressed the remote again, creak, creak. "Just wait, Karen," he said quietly. "You're gonna love this." He wasn't scared of her. He wasn't worried about the police or the HOA. He had something up his sleeve, and it was going to be huge. The sun started to go down. The sky turned orange and pink. Jake's yard looked even spookier in the fading light. The spider web glowed. The skeleton's shadow stretched across the grass. The coffin creaked louder, creak, creak, creak. Jake stood up and stretched. "Time to call it a day," he said. He went inside, still smiling. He didn't know Karen was watching him from her window, her eyes narrow and mean. Karen stood there, arms crossed. She saw Jake go inside. She saw the lights in his house turn on. "He thinks it's over," she said. "But it's not. I'm not done." She turned away from the window and grabbed her phone again. She was ready to call someone, anyone who would listen. The police, the HOA, her friends. She didn't care who. She just wanted Jake to lose. But Jake wasn't losing. Not yet. He was in his kitchen, making a snack. He hummed a little song and looked out his window. Karen's house was dark, but he knew she was in there. He knew she was mad. And he knew she'd try something else. "Go ahead," he said to himself. "Try whatever you want." He took a bite of his sandwich and grinned. That secret was still in his pocket, ready to come out when the time was right. The night got darker. Stars came out, twinkling in the sky. The neighborhood went quiet. But the tension? Oh, it was still there. You could feel it, like a rubber band stretched tight, ready to snap. Karen was mad. Jake was ready. And that secret? It was waiting, ticking like a clock. Tick, tick, tick. Something big was coming. Something wild. Something that would flip everything upside down. Karen didn't see it. She didn't know. She thought she was the boss, the one in charge. She thought her clipboard and her phone calls would win. But Jake? He was the one with the real power. He was the one with the plan. And every time Karen yelled or called the cops, she was just getting closer to the big surprise. A surprise she'd never expect. The next morning came fast. Jake woke up to another sunny day. He went outside and checked his yard. Everything was still there, the web, the skeleton, the coffin. "Good," he said. He grabbed a watering can to sprinkle his flowers. He was calm, happy, not worried at all. But across the street, Karen was already up. She was on her phone again, calling the police for the third time. "There's a problem," she said. "A big problem. You have to come." The sirens came back, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. Another police car rolled up. 2 more cops got out. They looked tired. "This again," one said. Karen ran over, shouting. "Arrest him. Look at this mess." The cops sighed. "Ma'am," one said, "we've been here twice. It's not illegal." Jake waved from his porch. "Hey, guys," he said. "Back again." The cops nodded. "Yep. She keeps calling." Karen stomped her foot. "This isn't fair," she yelled. "He's breaking rules." The cops shook their heads. "Not our rules," one said. They got back in their car and left. Karen stood there, shaking with anger. Jake laughed. "See ya, Karen," he called. She glared at him, then stormed back to her house. Bam! The door slammed again. Jake went back to watering his flowers. He pressed the remote in his pocket, creak, creak. The coffin answered. He smiled. "Oh, Karen," he said. "You're making this too easy." He didn't know what she'd try next. But he was ready. More than ready. That secret was getting closer to coming out, and when it did, it was going to be the best thing ever. The day stretched on. Karen kept plotting. Jake kept smiling. The neighborhood kept buzzing. Kids played, dogs barked, the sun shone. But under it all, the fight was growing. Karen versus Jake. Rules versus fun. And that secret? It was the key to everything. It was hiding, waiting, ready to explode. And when it did, oh boy, it was going to be wild. Karen didn't give up. She called the police again the next day. And the day after that. Sirens became normal in Oakwood Heights. Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. The cops kept coming, and they kept leaving. Not illegal, they'd say. Karen kept yelling. Jake kept laughing. Neighbors started watching. What's going on, they'd ask each other. Why's Karen so mad? No one knew the whole story. Not yet. But Jake knew. He knew his secret was safe. He knew Karen was digging herself deeper. Every call, every shout, every slam of her door, it was all part of his plan. He'd sit on his porch, watching her house, pressing that remote creak, creak. Just wait, he'd say. Just wait. The tension was thick now, like fog you could touch. Something had to give. Something had to happen. And it would. Soon. Very soon. Karen thought she was winning. She thought her calls and her clipboard would stop Jake. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know about the coffin. She didn't know about the remote. She didn't know about the secret. But she was about to find out. And when she did, her world was going to turn upside down. The sun set again. The stars came out. The the cops were back at Jake Riley's house. It was a sunny afternoon in Oakwood Heights, and the street was quiet except for Karen. The two police officers stood in front of Jake's yard, looking at his Halloween decorations. One cop, a tall guy with a big smile, tilted his head and stared at the giant spider web on the porch. "Nice setup, man," he said. He chuckled a little, like he thought it was cool. The other cop, a lady with short hair, nodded. She looked at the skeleton sitting on the porch swing. It rocked back and forth in the breeze, grinning with its plastic teeth. Karen Miller stood across the street on her lawn. Her arms were crossed, and her face was red like a big, mad apple. When she heard the cop laugh, her mouth fell open. "Arrest him," she screeched. Her voice was so loud, it made a squirrel run up a tree. She pointed at Jake with a shaky finger. "This is against HOA rules. He's breaking everything. Do something." She waved her clipboard in the air, like it was proof she was right. The cops turned to her. The tall one shrugged his shoulders. "Ma'am," he said, "this isn't illegal. It's just Halloween stuff." He waved his hand at the yard, the spider web, the tombstones, the creaky coffin in the grass. The lady cop nodded again. "Yeah," she said. "No laws broken here." They didn't look mad or worried. They looked like they wanted to go get lunch. Jake was standing on his porch, leaning against the railing. He was calm. Really calm. His messy brown hair flopped in the wind, and he had a little smile on his face. He watched Karen stomp her feet, her shoes going thump, thump, thump on the grass. She was so mad, she didn't even notice how silly she looked. "This is an outrage," she yelled. "I'm the HOA president. I say it's wrong." But the cops just shook their heads and started walking back to their car. Karen wasn't done, though. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and started dialing 9-1-1. Again. "Hello," she said when someone answered. "Yes, this is an emergency. There's a man breaking rules in my neighborhood. You need to send more police." Her voice got higher and squeakier with every word. The cops stopped walking and looked at each other. The tall one sighed. "She's calling again," he said quietly. The lady cop rolled her eyes. "Yep," she said. "Same thing as yesterday." Jake didn't say anything. He just watched. His hands were in his pockets, and he was fiddling with something. What was it? A little remote. Small, black, with one red button. Every time Karen raised her voice, like when she shouted emergency, Jake pressed that button. And every time he pressed it, the coffin in his yard creaked louder. Creak, creak. The sound echoed across the street, sharp and spooky. It was loud enough to make you jump if you weren't ready for it. The cops noticed. The tall one turned his head when the coffin creaked. He squinted at it, like he was trying to figure it out. "What's that?" he asked. Jake smiled bigger. "Oh, just my coffin," he said. "It's a Halloween thing." The lady cop looked at it too. Creak, creak. It went again when Karen yelled, "This is ridiculous." The cop tilted her head. "Pretty neat," she said. Then she whispered to the tall cop, "This guy's got something up his sleeve." The tall cop nodded. "Yeah," he whispered back. "Something's going on here." Karen didn't hear them. She was too busy ranting. "You can't let him do this," she shouted at the cops. "Look at that web. Look at that skull. It's ugly. It's loud. It's ruining everything." She stomped her foot again, thump, and waved her phone in the air. "I'll keep calling until you arrest him." The cop sighed. "Ma'am," the tall one said, "we're not arresting anyone. It's not a crime." They got in their car, started the engine, and drove off. Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. The sirens faded away. Jake stayed where he was, leaning on the railing. He watched Karen huff and puff. She was like a dragon, but without the fire, just a lot of hot air. He pressed the remote again, creak, creak, and the coffin answered. Karen didn't even look at it. She was too mad to care. She turned around and marched back to her house, her clipboard flapping like a bird's wing. The door slammed behind her, bam. Jake chuckled. "See ya, Karen," he said quietly. But Jake wasn't just laughing. He was counting. Counting down the minutes. Why? Because he knew something. Something big. Something Karen didn't know. He had a secret, a sneaky, spooky secret, and it was hiding right there in his yard. That coffin wasn't just a decoration. Nope. It was part of his plan. A big plan. And every time Karen yelled or called the cops, she was making it easier for him. She didn't see it. She didn't have a clue. But it was coming, and it was going to hit her like a ton of bricks. The day went on. The sun climbed higher, making the grass warm and bright. Jake stayed outside, messing with his decorations. He moved the skull Fred a little to the left. He tightened the spider web so it wouldn't fall. And every few minutes, he'd press that remote, creak, creak, just to hear the coffin. He'd smile every time. "Oh yeah," he'd say to himself. "This is working." Across the street, Karen was inside her house. She was madder than a bee stuck in a jar. She sat at her kitchen table, her phone in one hand and her clipboard in the other. "He's mocking me," she muttered. "He thinks he's so smart with his stupid decorations." She wrote on her clipboard, scribble, scribble, scribble. "Call HOA meeting," she wrote. "Tell everyone about Jake. Make him stop." She tapped her pen on the table, tap, tap, tap. She wasn't giving up. Not even a little. But Jake wasn't stopping either. He went inside for a minute and came back with a big bag of fake spiders. He started hanging them on the web, one by one. They were black and fuzzy, with little red eyes that glowed in the sun. Kids riding bikes stopped to look. "Cool," one shouted. "Spooky," said another. They laughed and pedaled away. Jake waved at them. "Thanks," he called. He was having fun. Lots of fun. Karen saw the kids from her window. She saw Jake hanging the spiders. Her eyes got narrow, like a cat watching a mouse. "More," she said. "He's adding more." She stood up so fast, her chair fell over, crash. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911 again. "Hello," she said. "Yes, it's an emergency. He's putting up more decorations. You have to come now." Her voice was loud and shaky. Jake heard her. Her window was open, and her yelling carried across the street. He pressed the remote, creak, creak, and grinned. "Keep going, Karen," he said quietly. "You're making this perfect." He didn't know exactly what she said on the phone, but he could guess. She was calling the cops again. And he was ready for it. Sure enough, the sirens came back. Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. Another police car rolled up. This time, It was two different cops, a guy with glasses and a lady with a hat. They got out and looked at Jake's yard. The guy with glasses scratched his head. "This again," he said. The lady with the hat sighed. "Third call today," she said. They walked up to Jake. "Hey," the guy said. "What's going on?" Jake shrugged. "Just decorating," he said. He pointed at the spiders. "Added these today." The lady cop smiled. "Nice," she said. "My kid would love this." Karen ran out of her house, her shoes thumping, thump, thump, thump. "Arrest him," she yelled. "He's making it worse. Look at those spiders." The cops turned to her. "Ma'am," the guy with glasses said, "we keep telling you it's not illegal." Karen's face went redder than ever. "Not illegal," she shouted. "It's horrible. It's ugly. It's against HOA rules." She waved her clipboard so hard, a paper fell off and floated to the ground. The lady cop picked it up and handed it back. "HOA isn't the law," she said. "He can do this." Karen stomped her foot, thump. "This isn't fair," she screeched. The cops shook their heads and left. "We gone again." Jake watched Karen storm back to her house. He pressed the remote, creak, creak, and the coffin creaked louder than ever. He laughed. "She's really mad now," he said. He sat on his porch steps and looked at his yard. The spiders looked awesome. The skeleton rocked. The tombstones glowed in the sun. "Perfect," he said. But he wasn't just happy about the decorations. He was happy because his plan was working. What plan? Well, here's a little hint: that coffin wasn't normal. Nope. It wasn't just a spooky box. It had something inside it, something secret. And that remote? It wasn't just for creaking. It was for something bigger. Jake had been setting this up for days. Every time Karen called the cops, every time she yelled, he got closer to the big moment. He was counting down not just minutes, but days. And it was almost time. Karen didn't know any of this. She was too busy being mad. She sat in her house, writing more notes. "Call police tomorrow," she scribbled. "Tell HOA board tonight." She was going to fight harder. She looked out her window and saw Jake sitting there, smiling. "He thinks he's won," she said. But he hasn't. She didn't hear the coffin creak. She didn't see Jake press the remote. She didn't know he was ready for her. The sun started to go down. The sky turned orange and pink. Jake's yard looked spookier in the fading light. The spider's eyes glowed red. The skeleton's shadow stretched long across the grass. The coffin creaked, creak, creak, creak like it was alive. Jake stood up and stretched. "Good day," he said. He went inside, still smiling. He didn't know Karen was watching him, her eyes sharp and mean. Karen stood by her window, arms crossed. "He's adding more every day," she muttered. "He's laughing at me." She grabbed her phone and called a friend from the HOA. "We need a meeting," she said. "Jake's out of control. We have to stop him." Her friend sighed. "Okay, Karen," she said. "Tomorrow night." Karen hung up and nodded. "Good," she said. "I'll win this." But Jake was winning too. He was in his kitchen, eating a snack. He pulled the remote out of his pocket and set it on the table. "Almost time," he said to himself. He didn't tell anyone his secret, not the cops, not the kids on bikes, not even his dog, Rusty. But it was there, hiding in that coffin. And every time Karen got mad, it got closer to coming out. The next day came fast. Jake woke up early and went outside. He added more decorations, a fake ghost that floated above the porch. It was white and wavy, like a sheet in the wind. Kids stopped to look. "Awesome," they shouted. Jake waved. "Thanks," he said. He pressed the remote, creak, creak, and the coffin answered. He grinned. "Getting closer," he said. Karen saw the ghost. She ran outside, her phone already in her hand. "More," she yelled. "More." She dialed 911 again. "Emergency," she said. "He's putting up a ghost now. Come quick." The sirens came back. "Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh." More cops showed up. They looked at the ghost and sighed. "Ma'am," one said, It's still not illegal. Karen screamed. This is crazy. The cops left. Jake laughed. Days turned into weeks. Karen kept calling. The cops kept coming. Jake kept adding stuffed bats, pumpkins, more skeletons. The yard got spookier and spookier. Neighbors started watching. What's with Karen, they'd say. Why's she so mad? Kids loved it. Best house ever, they'd shout. Jake waved at everyone, calm and happy. But inside, he was counting. Counting down to the big moment. Karen's rants got louder. She held her HOA meeting. We need new rules, she said. No decorations in September. But the board didn't listen. It's fine, Karen, they said. She stomped out, madder than ever. She called the cops again the next day. And the next. Sirens were normal now. We-oh-oh, we-oh-oh, we-oh-oh. The cops were tired. Stop calling, they told her. But she didn't. Jake watched it all. He pressed the remote every time she yelled creak, creak. The coughing got louder. The cops started noticing more. That thing's weird, one said. Yeah, said another. What's he doing with it? They didn't ask Jake, though. They just left. But they were right, something was up. Something big. One day, Jake added a sign. It said, "Beware the coffin," in big, red letters. Karen saw it and flipped out. A sign, she yelled. He's taunting me. She called 911 again. The cops came, looked, and left. Jake pressed the remote creak, creak, and smiled. Almost there, he said. He knew something Karen didn't. He knew the secret was ready. It was so close now, he could feel it. Karen kept ranting, oblivious. She didn't see the cops whispering. She didn't hear the coffin's creaks getting sharper. She didn't know Jake was waiting. Waiting for the perfect moment. Every call, every stomp, every yell, it was all leading up to it. And when it hit. Oh, it was going to be huge. Like a ton of bricks falling right on Karen's head. The neighborhood buzzed. Kids cheered. Neighbors watched. The tension grew. Jake stayed calm, pressing that remote, counting the minutes. Karen stayed mad, dialing her phone, writing her notes. She thought she was winning. She thought she'd stop him. But she didn't know the truth. She didn't know what was coming. And Jake? He was ready to show her. Soon. Very soon. Ached in the dark. Jake went to bed, smiling. Karen stayed up, plotting. The neighborhood slept, unaware. But the fight? It was alive. It was growing. And it was about to get a whole lot crazier. Stick around, this is just the start. It was a wild day in Oakwood Heights. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and Karen Miller was madder than ever. She stood on her lawn, waving her phone in the air like a flag. Neighborhood standards, she yelled. This is about neighborhood standards. Jake's decorations are ruining everything. Her voice was loud and squeaky, bouncing off the houses. She pointed at Jake Riley's yard across the street, his giant spider web, his grinning skeleton, his creaky coffin. She thought she was winning. She thought she had it all under control. Jake was on his porch, leaning against the railing. He watched Karen with a little smile. His messy brown hair flopped in the wind, and his hands were in his pockets. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, calm and quiet. Karen didn't notice how calm he was. She was too busy shouting. I've called the police 100 times, she said. They'll stop you, Jake. They have to. She smirked a sneaky, proud little smile like she'd already won the fight. But then something happened. Something big. A sound came from down the street. Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. Sirens. Another police car was coming. Karen's smirk got bigger. See, she shouted. They're back. They'll arrest you now. She waved her phone again, like it was magic. She thought the cops were there for Jake. She thought this was her big moment. The police car rolled up slow and steady. Its lights flashed red and blue, bright in the sunlight. It stopped right in the middle of the street. 2 officers stepped out. One was a man with a bald head and a serious face. The other was a lady with a ponytail and a notepad in her hand. Karen clapped her hands. Finally, she said. Get him. Take those awful decorations down. She pointed at Jake, sure she'd won. But the cops didn't go to Jake's house. Nope. They turned the other way. They walked straight across the street right to Karen's door. Her smirk disappeared. Her mouth fell open, like a fish out of water. Wait, what's this? She stammered. Her voice got small and shaky. She dropped her phone in the grass and took a step back. The cops didn't even look at Jake. They stopped at Karen's porch and knock, 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 knock. Loud and firm. Jake stepped forward. He walked down his porch steps, slow and easy. That little remote was still in his hand, the small, black one with the red button. He held it up, just enough for Karen to see. Oh, didn't I mention, Karen, he said. His voice was calm, but his smile was big. I've got friends on the force. And they've been watching you for weeks. He pressed the remote, creak, creak, and the coffin in his yard creaked loud and clear. Karen's eyes got wide. What? She said. Watching me? Friends on the force. She shook her head fast, like she didn't believe it. The bald cop turned to her. Karen Miller, he said. She nodded, still confused. Why yes, she stammered. The lady cop pulled out a piece of paper from her pocket. It was folded neat and official looking. We've got a warrant, she said. She held it up so Karen could see. A warrant? What's that? It's a paper that says the police can arrest someone if they did something bad. And Karen? Oh, she'd done something bad. Really bad. Jake grinned bigger than ever. Turns out, Karen, he said, you haven't just been harassing me. You've been scamming the HOA. He pointed at her house. Pocketing dues for your own fancy vacations. Karen's face went white like a ghost, or maybe one of Jake's decorations. No, she shouted. That's not true. You're lying. But the cops didn't listen. The bald one pulled out handcuffs, shiny, silver ones that clicked when he opened them. The lady cop started reading from the warrant. Karen Miller, she said, you're under arrest for stealing money from the HOA. We've got proof. Proof? What proof? Jake had it. He stepped closer, holding the remote like a prize. I suspected it for months, he said. You were always complaining about money, saying the HOA needed more dues. But then I saw you driving a fancy new car. And I heard you talking about trips to the beach. So I started watching. He pointed at the coffin in his yard. That coffin? It's not just spooky. It's been recording you every move. Karen's jaw dropped again. Recording, she said. What? She looked at the coffin. It sat there in the grass, big and wooden, creaking a little in the breeze. Creak, creak. Jake nodded. Yep, he said. Hidden cameras. Tiny ones. I put them in there weeks ago. Every time you yelled at me, every time you called the cops, it recorded you. And it caught you talking about the money you stole. The bald cop stepped forward. We've seen the videos, he said. You bragged about it on your porch. Said you used HOA cash for a trip to Hawaii. The lady cop nodded. And we checked the bank records, she said. The money's gone. You spent it? Karen shook her head fast. No, 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 she yelled. This is a trick. He's lying. You can't do this. But they could. The bald cop grabbed her arm, gentle but firm, and put the handcuffs on. Click, click. They snapped shut around her wrists. Karen's face twisted up. You can't do this, she screamed. She pulled against the cuffs, but they didn't budge. The lady cop held her other arm. Calm down, ma'am, she said. You're coming with us. Jake just stood there, grinning. He pressed the remote again, creak, creak, and the coffin creaked like it was laughing. Happy early Halloween, Karen, he said. His voice was cheerful, like he'd just won a game. And he had. A big game. Karen glared at him, her eyes sharp and mean. You little sneak, she shouted. I'll get you for this. But the cops didn't let her finish. They started walking her to the car. Neighbors came out of their houses. They'd heard the sirens, wee-oh-oh, and now they wanted to see what was happening. Mrs. Thompson from next door peeked over her fence. "What's going on?" she called. Mr. Lee from down the street stepped onto his porch. "Is that Karen?" he said. Kids on bikes stopped riding and stared. "Whoa," one said. "She's in handcuffs." Everyone was watching now. Jake waved at them. "Hey, everyone," he said. "Karen's been stealing HOA money. The cops got her." The neighbors gasped. "Stealing?" Mrs. Thompson said. "No way." Mr. Lee shook his head. "I knew she was trouble," he said. The kids giggled. "She's going to jail," one shouted. The street buzzed with voices talking, whispering, laughing. Karen heard it all. Her face went from white to red, redder than a tomato. "Shut up," she yelled at the neighbors. "This isn't true. He's lying." She pointed at Jake with her cuffed hands. But no one believed her. The cops opened the car door and helped her inside. "Watch your head," the lady cop said. Karen ducked in, still screaming. "I'll sue you, Jake. I'll sue all of you." The door shut thud, and her voice got muffled. Jake walked over to the coffin. He pressed the remote one more time, creak, creak, and then opened it up. The lid lifted slow and spooky, just like in a movie. Inside, tucked in a little box, were the cameras. Tiny, black, with blinking red lights. He pulled one out and held it up. "See," he said to the neighbors. "This caught everything." She didn't know. The crowd owed and awed. "Smart," Mrs. Thompson said. "Cool," a kid shouted. The cops started the car. "Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh." The sirens blared as they pulled away. Karen's face pressed against the window, glaring out at Jake. Her mouth moved, yelling something, but no one could hear it over the noise. The car turned the corner and was gone. The street went quiet again except for the coffin. Creak, creak. It creaked one last time, like it was saying goodbye. Jake put the remote in his pocket and turned to the neighbors. "Guess that's that," he said. He smiled big, his eyes twinkling. "Who wants to see the rest of my decorations?" The kids cheered. "Me. Me," they shouted. They ran over, jumping and laughing. Mrs. Thompson clapped. "You're a hero, Jake," she said. Mr. Lee nodded. "Good job," he said. "But let's back up a little. How did this all happen? How did Jake pull it off?" "Well, it started weeks ago. Jake loved Halloween, sure, but he was smart too. Really smart. He'd noticed Karen acting funny for months. She'd complain about HOA dues money everyone paid to keep the neighborhood nice. "We need more," she'd say at meetings. "The playground needs fixing." But the playground never got fixed. And then Jake saw her driving a shiny new car. And he heard her on her porch, talking on the phone about a trip to Hawaii. "Paid for it myself," she'd said. But Jake didn't buy it. So he made a plan. A big, sneaky plan. He went to the store and bought tiny cameras, little ones that could hide anywhere. He put them in his coffin decoration, the one that creaked. Why the coffin? Because it was big enough to hold them, and it sat right in the middle of his yard, perfect to see Karen's house. He hooked the cameras to a recorder, a little box that saved everything they saw. And he added the remote to make the coffin creak, just for fun and to keep Karen from getting too close. Every day, Jake watched. The cameras recorded. Karen would stand on her porch, yelling about his decorations. "Take them down," she'd shout. But sometimes, she'd talk about other stuff. "Got the money in my account," she'd say on the phone. "No one will know." Or, "Hawaii was worth it." The cameras caught it all, her voice, her words, her sneaky laughs. Jake saved every video. He knew he had something big. Then he called his friend, Officer Dan. Dan was a cop Jake knew from school. "Hey, Dan," Jake said one day. "I think Karen's stealing. I've got videos." Dan listened. "Send them to me," he said. Jake did. He emailed every clip, hours of Karen talking about the money she took. Dan watched them with his boss. "This is serious," his boss said. "She's been scamming the HOA." They checked the bank records. Sure enough, thousands of dollars were gone straight to Karen's account. So they made their own plan. They waited. They let Karen keep calling about Jake's decorations. Every time she did, "Wee-oh-oh, they'd come, look, and leave. But they were watching her too. They saw the videos. They heard her brag. And when they had enough proof, they got the warrant. That's why they showed up that day, not for Jake, but for Karen. Back to the moment. The police car was gone now. Karen was on her way to jail. Jake stood in his yard, surrounded by neighbors. Kids poked at the coffin, giggling when it creaked. Did it really record her? One asked. Yep, Jake said. He showed them the camera again. Caught every word. The kid's eyes got big. Whoa, he said. You're like a spy. Mrs. Thompson walked over. How'd you know? She asked. Jake shrugged. Just a hunch, he said. She acted too sneaky. And I love a good mystery. Mr. Lee laughed. Well, you solved it, he said. No more Karen bothering us. The neighbors cheered. Clap, clap, clap. They were happy. Really happy. Jake looked at his yard. The spider web sparkled. The skeleton rocked. The coffin sat there, open and proud. Worth it, he said to himself. He'd spent weeks setting it up, buying the cameras, hiding them, waiting for Karen to slip up. And she did. Big time. Now she was gone, and his decorations could stay. The sun started to set. The sky turned orange and pink, making the yard look extra spooky. Kids ran around, pretending to be ghosts. Boo, they shouted. Jake laughed. Best Halloween ever, he said. And it wasn't even Halloween yet. It was still September. But to Jake, it felt like a party already. Neighbors stayed a while, talking and smiling. You're a genius, Jake, one said. Thanks for stopping her, said another. They didn't like Karen much either. She'd bossed them around for years, telling them their grass was too long or their dogs were too loud. Now she was gone, and they were free. Jake waved as they left. See ya, he said. He sat on his porch steps, the remote in his hand. He pressed it one last time, creak, creak, and the coffin creaked like a big, happy ending. He leaned back and looked at the stars popping out in the sky. Got her, he said quietly. He smiled, big and proud. Karen's house was dark now. No lights, no yelling, no clipboard. She was in the police car, miles away, screaming about lawyers and revenge. But it didn't matter. The proof was too strong. The videos, the bank records, the warrant, she couldn't wiggle out of it. Jake had won. Big time. The night got quiet. The coffin stopped creaking. The neighborhood settled down. But the story? Oh, it wasn't over yet. Jake had more plans, more decorations, more fun. And Karen? She'd face her mess in court. But for now, the big reveal was done. The secret was out. The coffin had spoken. And Jake? He was the hero of Oakwood Heights. The police car rolled away from Oakwood Heights with Karen Miller inside. The sirens blared, wee-oh-oh, 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 fading into the distance. Karen was still yelling, her voice loud even through the closed window. This isn't fair, she shouted. I have rights. You'll hear from my lawyer. Her face was red, her hands cuffed behind her back. But the cops didn't care. They just kept driving. She was gone, and the neighborhood buzzed like a beehive kicked over. Jake Riley stood in his yard, watching the car disappear around the corner. His messy brown hair flopped in the breeze, and he had a big smile on his face. The remote was still in his hand, the little black one that made his coffin creak. He pressed it one more time, creak, creak, and the wooden box in the grass answered with a spooky sound. He laughed. See ya, Karen, he said quietly. He turned around and looked at his decorations. The giant spider web sparkled in the sunlight. The skeleton on the porch swing rocked back and forth. The tombstones stuck out of the grass like little teeth. They were still up, bigger and better than ever. Neighbors started coming out of their houses. They'd heard the sirens, seen the cops, and watched Karen get taken away. Now they wanted to know everything. Mrs. Thompson from next door ran over, her slippers flapping on the pavement. Jake, she called. What happened? Mr. Lee from down the street walked up, his dog on a leash. Did they really arrest Karen? He asked. Kids on bikes screeched to a stop, their eyes big. Is she gone? One shouted. Jake waved at them all. Yep, he said. Karen's been stealing HOA money. The cops caught her. The neighbors gasped. Stealing? Mrs. Thompson said. No way. Mr. Lee's dog barked, like it was surprised too. I knew she was sneaky, Mr. Lee said. Always bossing us around. The kids cheered. Yay, one yelled. No more mean lady. They dropped their bikes and ran over to Jake's yard. The street filled up fast. People who'd ignored Jake before, who'd walked by his house without a word, now stopped to talk. A man named Tom, who lived 3 houses down, held out his hand. High five, Jake, he said. Jake slapped his hand smack, and grinned. Thanks, Tom, he said. Tom laughed. You're a legend, he said. Getting rid of Karen? That's amazing. Mrs. Thompson nodded. A real hero, she added. Even Mr. Lee's dog wagged its tail, like it agreed. Jake's yard turned into a party. Kids ran around, poking at the coffin. Did it really record her? One asked. Jake pulled out one of the tiny cameras he'd hidden inside. Yep, he said. Caught every word. The kids' mouths dropped open. Cool, they shouted. They pretended to be spies, sneaking around the tombstones. I'm catching bad guys, one said. Me too, said another. Jake laughed. You're hired, he joked. The grown UPS stayed too. Mrs. Thompson brought cookies from her house, chocolate chip, still warm. For you, Jake, she said. You deserve it. Mr. Lee tied his dog to a tree and sat on the porch steps. Tell us more, he said. How'd you do it? Jake sat down too, munching a cookie. Well, he said, I knew she was up to something. So I put cameras in the coffin and waited. She talked about stealing money right where they could hear. Tom shook his head. Smart, he said. Really smart. Mrs. Thompson clapped her hands. And brave, she said. Standing up to her like that. Jake shrugged. Just wanted my decorations to stay, he said. And maybe have some fun. The neighbors laughed. You did more than that, Mr. Lee said. You saved us from her. The HOA, the group that made rules for the neighborhood, heard about it fast. That same week, they had a meeting. Not in Karen's house, like usual, but at Mrs. Thompson's. Everyone showed up: Tom, Mr. Lee, even people who never came before. They sat in the living room, eating cookies and talking loud. Karen's gone, Mrs. Thompson said. What do we do now? Tom raised his hand. Vote her out, he said. She can't be president if she's a thief. Everyone agreed. Yes, they shouted. Out with Karen. They wrote it down on a piece of paper, big letters that said, Karen Miller is not HOA president anymore. They all signed it, even Mr. Lee's dog, who left a paw print in ink. Good boy, Mr. Lee said, laughing. Then they picked a new president, Mrs. Thompson. Me, she said, surprised. Sure. Tom said. You're nice. Not like Karen. She smiled. Okay, she said. I'll do it. But they didn't stop there. They wanted to thank Jake. He's the reason she's gone, Mr. Lee said. Let's throw him a party. The room cheered. Clap, clap, clap. A party for Jake, they said. They planned it right then, Saturday night, in Jake's yard, with food and music and fun. No HOA rules against that. Tom joked. Everyone laughed. It was settled. Saturday came quick. The sun went down, and Jake's yard lit up. Neighbors brought lights, little strings of bulbs that glowed yellow and orange. They hung them on the porch, around the spider web, even on the coffin. Kids brought glow sticks, waving them like magic wands. Mrs. Thompson made more cookies, tons of them. Tom brought a big pot of spaghetti. Mr. Lee grilled hot dogs on a little barbecue. Smells good, Jake said, sniffing the air. Music played from a speaker, happy songs with lots of drums. Kids danced around the tombstones, giggling and jumping. Grown UPS sat on chairs or blankets, eating and talking. Best party ever, one said. Jake walked around, high-fiving everyone. Thanks for coming, he said. They high-fived back, smack, smack, smack. Thanks for saving us, they replied. Jake's decorations were the star of the night. The skeleton rocked on the swing, glowing under the lights. The spider web sparkled, with fake spiders dangling like jewels. The coffin sat in the middle, creaking every now and then, creak, creak. Kids dared each other to touch it. "It's not scary," one said, poking it. "It's cool," said another. Jake grinned. "Glad you like it," he said. Then he had an idea. He ran inside and came back with a big piece of wood and some paint. "Watch this," he said. He set the wood on the grass and started painting red letters, big and bold. Everyone gathered around, curious. "What's it say?" a kid asked. Jake kept painting, fast and neat. When he finished, he stepped back. The sign said, "Beware the HOA monster, she's gone," in bright, drip letters like something from a spooky movie. The crowd cheered woohoo. "Perfect," Mrs. Thompson said. "Love it," Tom shouted. The kids jumped up and down. "HOA monster's gone," they chanted. "HOA monster's gone." Jake hammered the sign into the ground, right next to the coffin. It stood tall, glowing under the lights. "That's for Karen," he said, laughing. Everyone clapped, clap, clap, clap. The party went late. Stars twinkled in the sky, and the air got cool. Kids yawned but didn't want to leave. "More cookies," one begged. Mrs. Thompson handed them out, crunch, crunch. Grown-ups sipped drinks and smiled. "No more Karen," Mr. Lee said. "Peace at last." Tom nodded. Thanks to Jake. They all looked at him, sitting on his porch steps, eating a hot dog. "You're the best, Jake," they called. He waved. "Ah, thanks," he said. As for the decorations, they stayed up way past September. Jake added more bats, pumpkins, even a fake witch on a broom. Kids stopped by every day to see. "Cooler than Halloween," one said. Parents loved it too. "Makes the street fun," one said. No one complained. No one wrote notes or called the cops. Karen was gone, and the rules were looser now. Mrs. Thompson made sure of that. "Decorate all you want," she told everyone at the next HOA meeting. They cheered again, woohoo. And Karen? She was far away, facing big trouble. The cops had taken her to jail after that wild day. She sat in a little room, still yelling about her rights. But no one listened. The videos from Jake's coffin were 2 good hours of her bragging about stealing. "HOA money's mine," she'd said on tape. "They'll never know." The bank records matched thousands of dollars gone, spent on her fancy trips and shiny car. She had to go to court. That's where a judge decides what happens to bad guys. The judge watched the videos, saw the records, and shook his head. "Guilty," he said. Karen's face went white again. "No," she shouted. But it didn't matter. She got charges, big ones. Stealing money is serious. She'd be busy for a long, long time, maybe years, paying for what she did. No more vacations. No more clipboard. Just a jail cell and a lot of regret. Back in Oakwood Heights, life got better. The playground finally got fixed. Mrs. Thompson used real HOA money for it. Kids swung on new swings and slid down shiny slides. "Thanks, Jake," they'd yell when they saw him. He'd wave from his yard. "No problem," he'd say. The neighborhood felt happy, happier than ever. No more mean ladies stomping around. No more angry notes on mailboxes. Just fun and peace. Jake kept his decorations up through October. Halloween came, and it was huge. Kids trick-or-treated at his house first. "Best candy," they said, grabbing handfuls. He dressed as a skeleton, matching the one on his swing. "Boo," he'd say, jumping out. They'd scream and laugh. Parents took pictures. "You're famous, Jake," one said. He grinned. "Just having fun," he said. The sign stayed too, "Beware the HOA monster, she's gone." It became a joke in the neighborhood. Kids pointed at it and giggled. "She's really gone," they'd say. Parents smiled. "Good riddance," they'd add. It was like a trophy, a big, red reminder of Jake's win. He'd look at it every day and nod. "Worth it," he'd say. Winter came, and the decorations came down. Jake packed them in boxes, spider web, skeleton, coffin, all of it. But he kept the cameras, Just in case. Never know, he said with a wink. The yard went quiet, covered in snow. But the neighbors didn't forget. They'd stop by with cookies or hot cocoa. "You're still our hero," Mrs. Thompson said one day. Jake laughed. "Ah, thanks," he said. Karen. She didn't come back. Court kept her busy: lawyers, judges, papers. She'd lost her house sold to pay back the money she stole. Someone new moved in, a nice family with a little dog. "No clipboard here," they joked. The neighborhood moved on, happier without her. Jake's party became a story they'd tell forever: the time Jake caught the HOA monster. Kids loved it. Grown-ups too. Spring arrived, and Jake started planning again. "More decorations this year," he said. "Bigger ones." The neighbors cheered. "Woohoo. Can't wait," Mrs. Thompson said. They knew it'd be fun. They knew Jake would make it awesome. And they knew no one would stop him, not anymore. Justice was served. Karen was gone, facing her mess. Jake's decorations stayed, loved by all. The HOA was fair now, thanks to Mrs. Thompson. And the neighborhood? It buzzed with joy, not anger, not rules, but fun. Jake sat on his porch, looking at the sign one last time before summer. "Beware the HOA monster, she's gone." He smiled. "Yep," he said. "She sure is." So, here's the thing, sometimes the guy with the goofy decorations isn't the troublemaker. Nope. Sometimes the loudest complainer, the one yelling and stomping and waving a clipboard, is the one hiding the dirtiest secrets. That's what happened in Oakwood Heights with Jake Riley and Karen Miller. Jake proved something big. He showed that standing up for yourself, using your brain, and adding a little creativity can turn everything around in the best way. Let's talk about that because it's a story worth thinking about. Picture Jake for a second. He's just a regular guy, right? Messy hair, big smile, loves Halloween a little too much. He's the kind of person you might walk by and not even notice. He's not loud. He's not mean. He's just Jake, hanging spider webs and making coffins creak. But he's also smart. Really smart. And brave too. He didn't let Karen scare him. She yelled, she called the cops, she wrote angry notes, but Jake? He kept going. He didn't fight with fists or shouts. He fought with a plan. A sneaky, clever plan that flipped the whole game upside down. Now think about Karen. She was the loud one. The bossy one. She walked around with her clipboard like she owned the whole neighborhood. "Take that down," she'd yell. "This is wrong," she'd screech. Everyone thought she was just grumpy. Annoying, sure, but harmless. Wrong. She was hiding something huge, stealing money from the HOA, sneaking it away for fancy trips and a shiny car. She thought no one would catch her. She thought she was the boss. But Jake? He saw through her. He didn't just sit there and take it. He did something about it. That's the cool part. Jake didn't need to be loud or mean to win. He used what he had: his love for Halloween, his decorations, and a little remote. That coffin? It wasn't just spooky. It was his secret weapon. With tiny cameras inside, it watched Karen every day. It listened when she bragged about her stealing. It caught her when she thought no one was looking. Jake turned something fun, his goofy decorations, into something powerful. And when the cops came, when the truth came out, Karen didn't stand a chance. So what's the lesson here? It's simple: you don't have to be the loudest to be the strongest. Sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who seem silly or small, are the ones with the big ideas. Jake didn't yell back at Karen. He didn't stomp his feet or call her names. He stayed calm. He stayed smart. He stood up for himself in his own way by being clever and creative. And that's what turned the tables. That's what made him the hero of Oakwood Heights. Think about your own life for a minute. Ever had someone boss you around? Maybe a kid at school who's always telling you what to do. Or a grown-up who thinks they're in charge of everything. Maybe they're loud, like Karen, pointing fingers and making rules. What would you do? Would you yell back? Would you give up? Or would you be like Jake, quiet, sneaky, smart? Jake didn't fight fire with fire. He fought fire with a coffin full of cameras. And he won. Big time. That's what's so awesome about this story. It shows you can win without being mean. You can win by being you. Jake loved Halloween goofy skeletons, creepy webs, all of it. He didn't change that for Karen. He didn't take it down because she said so. He used it. He turned his fun into his power. And when Karen tried to stop him, he didn't just save his decorations, he saved the whole neighborhood from her sneaky tricks. Let's imagine something. What if Jake hadn't done anything? What if he'd read Karen's note, take down those hideous decorations, and said, okay, fine? What if he'd pulled down the spider web, packed up the skeleton, shut the coffin? Karen would have kept stealing. She'd have kept bossing everyone around. The HOA money would have disappeared, more trips, more cars, more lies. The playground would have stayed broken. The neighbors would have stayed annoyed. Jake's yard would have been boring. And Karen? She'd have thought she was the queen forever. But Jake didn't give up. He stood tall, not with his voice, but with his actions. He said, this is my yard. This is my fun. I'm not stopping. And he didn't just save his Halloween. He showed everyone that you can fight back smart, quiet, and strong. That's why the neighbors high-fived him. That's why they threw him a party. That's why they put up that sign, beware the HOA monster, she's gone. Jake didn't just win a fight. He made things better for everyone. So here's a question for you, could you outsmart a Karen like that? Think about it. Maybe you're not into Halloween like Jake. Maybe you love soccer or drawing or video games. Whatever it is, you've got something fun, something you're good at. What if someone tried to take it away? What if they said, stop that? It's dumb. Would you give in? Or would you find a way to turn it around, like Jake did? Drop it in the comments, I wanna know. Tell me what you'd do. Tell me your sneaky, smart ideas. Because that's the thing, everyone's got a little Jake inside them. You don't need a coffin or cameras. You just need you. Maybe you'd draw a picture to trick the bossy kid. Maybe you'd kick a soccer ball so good, they'd leave you alone. Maybe you'd build something cool to show them up. Whatever it is, you can do it. Jake proved it. He took his goofy decorations and made them a superhero tool. You can take what you love and make it big too. And here's another cool thought, sometimes the bad guys don't look like bad guys. Karen didn't wear a villain mask. She didn't have a cape or an evil laugh, at least, not a good one. She just looked grumpy. She acted like she cared about rules, neighborhood standards. But really, she cared about herself. She was sneaky, not scary. But Jake saw it. He didn't judge her by her clipboard or her loud voice. He watched. He listened. He figured her out. That's a superpower too, seeing the truth behind the noise. What about you? Ever met someone who seemed nice but wasn't? Maybe they smiled a lot but said mean things. Or maybe they acted big but hid something sneaky. Jake's story says, look closer. Don't just believe the loudest voice. Don't just follow the bossiest person. Use your eyes, your ears, your brain. You might catch something big like Jake did. You might turn it all around. Let's dream a little more. Imagine Oakwood Heights now. Karen's gone. Jake's decorations are up. The neighbors are happy. Kids play on a fixed playground. Mrs. Thompson runs the HOA with cookies and smiles. It's peaceful. It's fun. All because one guy didn't back down. One guy with a spooky coffin and a sneaky plan made everything better. That's power, not loud power, not mean power, but quiet, clever power. You've got that power too. Somewhere inside, it's waiting. So what's next? Well, Jake's not done. He's got more decorations planned, bigger webs, taller skeletons, maybe a ghost that flies. The neighborhood can't wait. And me? I've got more stories, wild ones, funny ones, spooky ones. Stick around, because there's more where this came from. This isn't the end, it's just the start. Jake showed us how to win with creativity. What will you do with yours? Before I go, let's think one more time. Jake wasn't the troublemaker, even though Karen said he was. She was loud, but she was wrong. He was quiet, but he was right. Standing up for yourself doesn't mean shouting. It means doing what you love, being smart, and not giving up. Jake turned the tables flip, and made something great. You can too. Maybe not with a coffin, but with whatever makes you happy. So tell me, could you outsmart a Karen? Could you be a Jake? Drop it in the comments. I wanna hear your ideas, your plans, your sneaky tricks. And hey, don't go anywhere, more crazy stories are coming. See you next time, friends. Keep being clever, keep being you, and keep turning those tables. Bye for now.